Welcome to Audit the Audit, where we sort out the who and what and the right and wrong of police interactions. This episode covers occupancy laws, identification laws in Texas, and local ordinances, and is brought to us by Texas Rebels Channel. Be sure to check out the description below and give them the credit that they deserve. On October 13, 2019, Denton County resident Charles Stark was involved in a domestic dispute with his roommate and intimate partner, Tabitha. The two engaged in a verbal conflict that eventually prompted Tabitha to call the police to escort her as she gathered her belongings to leave. Soon after, two officers from the Little Elm Police Department in Little Elm, Texas, arrive on the scene and make contact with Tabitha and Mr. Stark. The officers then escort Mr. Stark away from Tabitha in order to get his side of the story. Before we dive into the interaction, I want to give a big shout out to the sponsor of this episode, Raid Shadow Legends. You all know Raid is the most robust and hottest free-to-play RPG mobile game of 2019, but since then, Raid has exploded with new content. Not only has Raid expanded to the PC, but it has also enabled cross-platform gaming so that you can play with anyone on any device. Season 1 of Raid's Battle Pass just went live, and I have already won a ton of upgraded artifact sets and epic and legendary champions by doing the daily and weekly challenges. I love Raid because it is such a diverse game, and whether you're playing for 5 minutes or 5 hours, there is always something fun to do. You can find me in the game under the name Audit the Audit, and right now, new players who click on my special links in the description will get 100,000 silver, 50 gems, 1 energy refill, and a free champion, the Adjudicator. You can find your rewards in your in-game inbox for the next 30 days only, so click that link before it's too late. Thanks again to Raid for sponsoring this episode.
I don't do irrational behavior at all. I've been in prison. I don't have time for this stuff. I know I don't want trouble when you're out.
Let's lower the voice a little bit because I don't want her to hear what you're saying because I want you to be able to speak in private, right?
Yes.
So that's fair. So we get your story and her story separately. Does that make sense?
I don't have time for this.
Okay.
Listen,
I get you.
I'm talking to you.
Yeah.
That there? That.
Yeah.
I don't have time for that.
Sure.
So I just want to get out.
After briefly listening to Mr. Stark's complaints, the officer begins to ask a series of questions in order to ascertain the nature of Mr. Stark and Tabitha's relationship.
How long have you known her?
2 years.
How often does she come over?
All the time.
Does she have any property here? Any clothes?
Yes,
furniture?
a lot of it.
Unlike most states, Texas considers many factors beyond the length of occupancy to establish residency, such as whether the occupant pays bills, contributes to household expenses, or has property at the residence. Subsection 6 of Section 92.001 of the Texas Property Code defines a tenant as a person who is authorized by a lease to occupy a dwelling to the exclusion of others. While the term lease implies a signed written contract, subsection 3 of section 92.001 defines a lease as any written or oral agreement between a landlord and tenant that establishes or modifies the terms, conditions, rules, or other provisions regarding the use and occupancy of a dwelling. This means that the state of Texas recognizes verbal lease contracts as valid and actionable, and courts often identify occupants who are not on the original lease as month-to-month tenants who have entered into a verbal lease agreement with the original lessee. Mr. Stark admitted that he had a long-term relationship with Tabitha and that she owned property and regularly stayed at the residence for a month. This information would likely influence a court's decision of whether Tabitha and Mr. Stark had established a verbal lease agreement, with Mr. Stark acting as Tabitha's landlord. Informal renting agreements do not always involve monetary exchanges, and what constitutes a legitimate verbal lease agreement would certainly be subject to the interpretation of a court. The waters of legal occupancy and verbal lease agreements are particularly muddy for cases involving a significant other. And although Mr. Stark is the primary leaseholder, Tabitha may still have a legitimate legal claim to his residence. The officer informs Mr. Stark that he is relatively experienced with eviction law and court proceedings, and attempts to warn Mr. Stark about Tabitha's ability to claim occupancy.
My only concern is if she has property here, she's been spending the night.
She gets no mail here. She's not on a lease. She's not. It hasn't been 30 days. She's not a squatter. She has zero rights to this place.
Well, if she's claiming, if she makes any kind of claim
Like what?
that she lives here,
She's getting mail here. She's not her mailing address.
no, that doesn't matter. A lot of people don't update their mailing address.
They have squatter rights. I understand that, but she does not have any of that.
But
She's not on a
if
lease.
she's been staying the night here and has property here,
Property?
a judge,
Like
clothes, furniture, anything of the sort, a judge may side with her as far as.
Absolutely, I got better lawyers than that. I promise you.
Okay, that's fine. But here's the thing. I'm not saying you can't ask her to leave. If she wants to, that's fine. But if she wants to fight that, what I'm saying is you may want to evict her.
Even with the luxury of not having a written lease contract with Tabitha, Mr. Stark must still follow the appropriate legal avenues to remove her from the residence. Because no written lease exists, Mr. Stark is required to give Tabitha a 3-day written notice to vacate the premises before proceeding with legal action, which could potentially take weeks or even months in some extreme cases. Mr. Stark and the officer momentarily debate the status of Tabitha's occupancy before the officer asks Mr. Stark to present his identification.
Do you have your ID on you?
Yes, I do.
Do you mind if I just log that so I can say who I spoke to?
My ID.
Okay, well, I need to identify you because we're investigating.
I haven't broken any laws.
Okay, well, I need to know who you are.
If I need to show my ID, I have to be either suspected of a crime or committed a crime, sir. Come on, man.
You're
Let's not go there.
detained. You're detained for
what?
an investigation.
For what?
For a disturbance.
I'm not. Well, she's disturbing, not I.
Okay, well, we're here to investigate it,
Okay,
so
understand.
I need your ID.
But investigation of disturbance is not a crime. It's not a crime. I know that.
No, but you are detained. You're
For
not
what?
under
Well, I
arrest.
mean,
You're
but
detained.
to be trying to detain, though, you have to be either committing a crime or suspect of committing a crime. I've done neither.
We're here
I'm in my own home.
investigating a disturbance,
In
okay?
my home, right?
Sure.
Okay.
It doesn't matter where you are.
Okay. You're investigating, but an investigation is not a crime.
Although the officer does have reasonable suspicion to detain and investigate Mr. Stark because of Tabitha's 911 call, his authority essentially ends there. Texas Penal Code 38.02 provides that individuals do not have to surrender their name, residence address, or date of birth to a peace officer unless they have been lawfully arrested. Mr. Stark is under no legal obligation to surrender his identification during the officer's investigatory detention, and whether or not the officer had reasonable suspicion is irrelevant. Texas is one of the few states that require an officer to arrest an individual before identifying them. And outside of a traffic stop, any Texan officer who orders a detainee to identify themselves is doing so illegally.
No,
You didn't detain
I'm
me.
investigating a crime, so go ahead and give me your ID.
Whoa, hold on. I haven't committed a crime.
I don't know that.
You do know that.
I talked to you, and I've got your side, and I
Get
have
your
to go
partner.
talk to my
Go
partner.
talk to your
here.
partner first.
I need your ID.
You don't have my ID. I'm not committing a crime. This is my house, okay? I'm asking her to leave my house, not the other way around. She's not my wife. She's not my girlfriend. She's nothing. You don't need to see my ID
Yeah,
for
but
that.
listen, just because it's your house doesn't mean it's home base and you can do whatever you want.
Well, my cousin works in Turtle Affairs.
Okay.
Let me call him really fast.
Listen,
No,
sir.
no, listen to me.
No,
you don't get. I'm not telling you.
Listen, stop.
I'm not trying to amp
If
it
you
up.
make a phone call, you're going to jail.
Why?
Because I'm telling
Why?
you not to.
Why?
Give me your
I'm
ID.
not under arrest, am I?
Give me. You're detained.
Am
It's
I-
the same thing.
am I
You're
under arrest?
you're in custody
Under
until I
for
release
what?
you. I told you for an investigation, so give me your ID or you're going to go to
Whoa,
jail.
time out for what? Texas is not a state. Texas is not an identified state.
Listen, we were at a cool, calm level. All I'm asking
You're
you to do is
amping up. You're
identify.
asking for my ID. I told them I have to give it to you.
Yeah, you do.
For what? I'm not.
I've explained this to you
What
multiple
crime
times.
did I
This is your
commit?
last chance.
What crime?
Give me your
did I
ID or
commit?
you're going
What
to
crime did I
jail.
commit?
All right, you're going
Well,
to
hold on
jail.
a second.
The officer handcuffs Mr. Stark and later informs him why he is being restrained.
You're being charged with defiance of authority
When? How?
because I gave you a lawful order to identify yourself.
Right, is that
and
a
you refused
crime?
to.
Is that
Yeah.
a crime?
Yes.
It's a crime to refuse the ID?
It's a
in
town
Texas?
ordinance. You're required to follow lawful order in town
But the
law.
lawful-
The officer is likely referring to Section 70-181 of the Little Elm Code of Ordinance, which states that it is unlawful for a person to fail or refuse to comply with an order or direction of a peace officer. However, subsection C of that code notes that an officer's orders must be lawful and tolerant of free speech for the charge to be valid in court. The officer's orders were unlawful under TPC 38.02, and Mr. Stark was ultimately charged with resisting arrest and harassing a public servant. He was then taken to the Denton County Jail while Tabitha was allowed to remain at the residence. Tabitha assured the officers that she would be moved out before Mr. Stark was released from jail. An account that appears to belong to Mr. Stark replied to a comment on the original video stating that he has not been able to secure legal representation, but implied that he is actively looking. Overall, the responding officer of the Little Elm Police Department gets an F for displaying a fundamental misunderstanding of Texas Penal Code, unlawfully ordering Mr. Stark to surrender his ID, and arresting Mr. Stark when he had committed no crime. Barring the involvement of violence, Texas officers are legally bound to consider the factors that the court has deemed relevant when dealing with occupancy disputes, and the officers handled that aspect of this interaction with an acceptable degree of professionalism. It was the officer's unlawful demand to see Mr. Stark's ID that escalated this interaction into an arrest. If the officers had chosen to focus on the dispute at hand, instead of forcing Mr. Stark to identify himself, this interaction could have easily reached a peaceful and relatively permanent resolution. The LEPD officers missed an opportunity to de-escalate this interaction by focusing on Mr. Stark's defiance against frivolous and unlawful orders. Mr. Stark gets an A-, because although he could have chosen to remain silent more often, Mr. Stark demonstrated a respectable understanding of Texas Penal Code and maintained a calm and collected demeanor, despite being somewhat emotionally distraught from the prior verbal altercation. Mr. Stark was respectful, honest, and compliant with the officers until he was unlawfully ordered to produce his ID, and even then, he made his best effort to engage with the officers in a peaceful but affirmative dialogue. Although Mr. Stark's conduct was not able to save him from being arrested, it will serve him well in the courtroom should his case go to trial. I commend Mr. Stark for peacefully invoking his rights and keeping his emotions in check throughout this encounter. Let us know if there is an interaction or legal topic you would like us to cover in the comments.